If you were to ask a modern historian to name the single worst year to be alive in human history, your mind might instinctively wander to the biggest horrors of our past. You might think of the brutal, industrial slaughter of the First World War. You might recall the terrifying devastation of the Black Death, which wiped out half of Europe's population in a matter of years. Or perhaps the sudden collapse of the Bronze Age, when ancient empires vanished into smoke over the course of a single generation. But in recent years, scientists, archaeologists, and climate historians have looked past these famous catastrophes to point their fingers at a different, highly specific coordinate in time.
A year that did not just change a continent, but structurally broke the world. The year 536. To understand the sheer terror of 536, you have to understand the world that preceded it. This was not a primitive or disconnected world. In the Mediterranean, the Eastern Roman Empire was undergoing a spectacular renaissance under Emperor Justinian. His brilliant generals were reconquering lost lands, attempting to rebuild the shattered glory of old Rome. Magnificently engineered cities traded silk, spices, and grain across vast maritime networks. In China, sophisticated dynasties ruled over millions, anchored by highly organized agricultural systems. And in Mesoamerica, the massive metropolis of Teotihuacan stood as a masterpiece of human engineering. Humanity was hyperconnected, technologically advanced, and deeply dependent on predictable climate cycles. And then, without warning, the sky broke. In the spring of 536, a bizarre, unnatural phenomenon manifested over Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. The sun, the ultimate source of all life and warmth, suddenly began to dim. It lost its brilliance, casting a pale, sickly, bluish light over the earth. Dense, impenetrable clouds of blue-gray fog rolled across the valleys, refusing to disappear. For 18 months, the world was plunged into a twilight that never ended.
The famous Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from the heart of Constantinople, recorded the unfolding nightmare with a sense of quiet dread. He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in an eclipse. In Italy, the Roman statesman Cassiodorus looked up at the sky and realized that the natural order of the cosmos had collapsed. He wrote that the sun seemed to have lost its light and appeared of a bluish color. He marveled that people could see no shadows of their bodies at noon. The summer had no heat, the crops withered under a cold north wind, and the earth refused to ripen her fruits. This was not a temporary local weather anomaly. It was a global climate cataclysm. And as the sun refused to shine, the global economy, agricultural stability, and human health began to unravel in a terrifying domino effect. This is the story of the year the light died. Imagine waking up every morning for a year and a half, looking out your window and seeing a sky that resembles a permanent, gloomy twilight. Imagine the psychological toll on a population that believed the sun was a direct manifestation of divine favor. To the people of 536, it felt as though God had permanently turned his face away from humanity. But the psychological horror was nothing compared to the physical reality that followed. Because the sun's rays were blocked by this mysterious atmospheric shroud, global temperatures plummeted. The year 536 initiated the coldest decade the Northern Hemisphere had experienced in over 2,000 years. It marked the beginning of a brutal, multi-decade cold snap that fundamentally altered human geography. The impact on agriculture was immediate and catastrophic. Without adequate sunlight and warmth, the growing seasons shrunk to near zero. In the summer of 536, snow fell in China. Ancient Chinese chronicles record that in the months of July and August, heavy yellow dust fell like rain, followed by severe frosts that completely destroyed the grain crops. In the mid-6th century,
A failed harvest meant immediate, large-scale starvation for millions of peasants. The chronicles state that the famine became so severe that people resorted to eating the bark of trees, wild weeds, and eventually, each other.
On the other side of the world, the situation was equally apocalyptic. The historical chronicles of medieval Ireland record a devastating failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In a society where grain and bread were the literal foundations of survival, a multi-year failure of bread was a polite historical term for a societal death sentence. In Scandinavia, the ecological shock was so severe that it permanently altered the culture and geography of the region. Archaeological excavations across Sweden and Norway show that in the mid-6th century, nearly 75% of villages in certain regions were completely abandoned. The people either starved to death in their homes or fled south in a desperate bid for survival. Many scholars believe that this exact historical trauma is what birthed the famous Norse myth of Ragnarok, the end of the world.
Specifically, the myth speaks of Fimbulwinter, a terrifying, apocalyptic winter that lasts for 3 consecutive years without a summer in between. A winter where snow drives from all directions, frost hardens the earth, and a giant wolf finally catches and devours the sun. To the ancient Norse, Ragnarok wasn't just a poetic fantasy. It was a core memory of what their ancestors had actually lived through, starting in 536. As the initial months of darkness stretched into a second year, the structural foundations of the civilized world began to buckle. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the agricultural engine of Egypt, which supplied grain to the entire Mediterranean, saw its crop yields plummet. The tax revenues that Emperor Justinian relied on to fund his massive military campaigns began to dry up. The armies stationed in the field found themselves undersupplied, unpaid, and starving.
Humanity was trapped in a global freezer. Their crops were rotting in the soil, their livestock were dying of starvation, and their bodies were becoming profoundly weakened by malnutrition. And it was precisely at this moment, when human civilization was at its absolute weakest, its immune systems compromised, and its cities crowded with starving refugees, that a secondary, even more terrifying monster emerged from the shadows. The darkness had prepared the ground. Now, it was time for the harvest. Imagine a world that is already on its knees. For over 5 long years, the sun has been nothing more than a pale, ghostly shadow in the sky. Crops have rotted in the fields from constant frost. Empires have run out of money, and millions of families are wandering the ruins of their villages in a desperate search for food. Humanity was freezing, starving, and profoundly weak. And it was precisely at this moment, when the world's immune system was completely broken, that a second, far more terrifying monster emerged from the shadows.
In the summer of 541, a mysterious merchant ship docked at the Egyptian port city of Pelusium. It carried a standard cargo of grain, but it also brought something else hidden in its dark belly. Buried deep within the ship's holds, infected rats were carrying a microscopic killer that the ancient world had never encountered before. Today, we know it as Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. The timing was mathematically perfect for an apocalypse. Because of the global cooling that started in 536, millions of people across the Mediterranean had migrated into crowded, unsanitary cities looking for charity. Their bodies were severely malnourished, making them the perfect fuel for a wildfire of disease. From the ports of Egypt, the plague traveled along the Roman maritime trade routes like a shockwave. Within months, it reached the beating heart of the civilized world, Constantinople. What followed was a slaughter on a scale that defies imagination. The contemporary chronicles describe a magnificent metropolis transformed into a living hell. At its absolute peak, the plague was killing up to 5,000 and sometimes even 10,000 people a day in a single city. There were simply not enough living people left to bury the dead. Graveyards overflowed instantly.
Emperor Justinian ordered massive, industrial-scale trenches to be dug outside the city walls, each capable of holding 70,000 bodies. When those filled up, the roofs were ripped off the city's giant defensive towers, and corpses were packed inside them until they were completely full. The stench of decaying humanity hung over the Mediterranean coast for miles. The psychological impact on the survivors was devastating. People began to realize that this was not just a bad harvest or a temporary misfortune. To the citizens of the Roman Empire, it felt like a systematic, divine execution of the human race. First, the light of the cosmos was extinguished. Then, the earth refused to grow food. And finally, their own flesh began to betray them.
Even the emperor himself, Justinian, caught the disease. He miraculously survived, but the empire he had spent his entire life building did not. The plague completely destroyed the Roman economy. With nearly a third of the population dead, there was no one left to pay taxes, no one left to farm the land, and no one left to guard the borders. The glorious reconquest of Italy and the restoration of the old Roman Empire died in those plague pits. The ancient world had not just slowed down, it had structurally broken. But while the Mediterranean was drowning in disease, the cosmic cloud of 536 was triggering equally violent catastrophes across the rest of the globe. To understand what truly caused this planetary blackout, we have to look at a terrifying chain reaction that stretched from the Americas all the way to the frozen steppes of Asia.
The freezing fog of 536 did not stop at the borders of the Roman Empire. It was a planetary shroud, and it triggered a terrifying domino effect that shook civilizations thousands of miles away. In East Asia, the sudden drop in temperature completely shattered the political balance of power. For centuries, the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppes had relied on vast grasslands to feed their horses and livestock. But when the endless winter of 536 arrived, the grass simply stopped growing.
Faced with total starvation, the nomadic confederacies had no choice but to move. A massive wave of desperate, hungry warriors began migrating south toward the borders of China, looking for land and food. This climate-driven migration triggered decades of brutal warfare, leading to the sudden collapse of established Chinese dynasties. Further west, the crisis set off another chain reaction. Scholars believe that the freezing weather pushed a new group of fierce steppe nomads, known as the Avars, out of Central Asia. They moved relentlessly westward until they slammed into Eastern Europe, forcing local tribes to flee and fundamentally reshaping the map of the European continent. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the Americas were experiencing their own version of the apocalypse. In the high valleys of central Mexico, the magnificent metropolis of Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It was a thriving center of trade, culture, and monumental stone architecture. But its survival depended entirely on sophisticated farming. When the global climate broke, the region was hit by catastrophic, multi-year droughts, alternated with unpredictable frost. The city's massive reservoirs dried up, and the corn crops failed year after year.
As hunger spread through the grand avenues of Teotihuacan, societal trust completely dissolved. Archaeologists have discovered that around this exact time, the city's grand palaces, temples, and elite residences were systematically burned and destroyed. Crucially, the destruction was internal. This was not a foreign invasion. It was a violent, desperate rebellion of a starving population rising up against a ruling class that could no longer pray to the gods for rain. The greatest city in North America was reduced to ashes, abandoned by its people, and left to be swallowed by the dust.
Further south, in the coastal deserts of Peru, the advanced Moche civilization suffered an identical fate. For generations, they had mastered irrigation and built vast mud brick kingdoms. But the climate chaos of the mid-6th century unleashed a nightmare combination of mega droughts and violent torrential floods. Their fields were washed away, their fishing grounds collapsed, and within a few decades, their entire civilization completely vanished from history. From the forests of Europe to the steppes of Asia, and from the valleys of China to the deserts of South America, human civilization was being systematically dismantled. The modern world often views history as a story of separate nations and independent empires, but the crisis of 536 proved that all of humanity was ultimately bound to the same fragile heartbeat of our planet. For centuries, survivors looked up at the pale, sickly sky and wondered what kind of cosmic anger had brought this doom upon them. They blamed their sins, their gods, and their emperors. But none of them could have guessed that the true architect of their suffering lay hidden thousands of miles away, deep beneath the Earth's crust. For nearly 1,500 years, the global catastrophe of 536 remained one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. We had the terrifying accounts of Roman historians, the desperate chronicles of Chinese dynasties, and the silent, abandoned ruins of cities in the Americas. But we had no answers. What could possibly possess the power to blot out the sun across the entire planet for 18 months? For a long time, mainstream historians were skeptical. Some argued that the ancient writers were simply exaggerating, using poetic metaphors to describe a typical bad winter or a solar eclipse. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, modern science stepped into the arena. And what they found changed everything. The breakthrough did not happen in a library or an archive. It happened in the most desolate, frozen places on Earth, the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. Scientists began drilling deep into the polar ice, pulling up long, cylindrical cores. These ice cores act like a geological time machine. Every single year, as snow falls over the Arctic, it traps tiny particles from the atmosphere and freezes them into a perfect, permanent layer of ice. By counting these layers backward, scientists can read the history of the Earth's atmosphere, like the rings of a tree. When the researchers analyzed the layers corresponding to the exact year of 536, they found something shocking. The ice was packed with extraordinarily high concentrations of sulfur, bismuth, and volcanic ash. This was the smoking gun. The pale sky, the blue fog, and the endless winter were not myths or exaggerations. They were the direct result of an unprecedented volcanic supereruption. The scale of this eruption defies anything humanity has witnessed in modern times. An immense volcano, likely located in Iceland, violently exploded in early 536. The blast ripped through the Earth's crust,
spewing millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas and microscopic ash directly into the stratosphere. Once inside the upper atmosphere, these particles formed a colossal, reflective blanket that wrapped around the entire northern hemisphere. This shield acted like a mirror, bouncing the sun's rays back into space and preventing them from reaching the surface. But the detective story didn't end there. As scientists analyzed more ice cores, they discovered that the planet was hit by a double blow. Just a few years later, in 540, a second massive volcano erupted halfway across the world in El Salvador.
This second eruption released another massive wave of ash into the atmosphere, directly over the tropics. The two volcanic clouds effectively combined, creating a planetary shroud that locked the world into a continuous, decades-long cold snap. It was a statistical anomaly of pure cosmic bad luck. Humanity was not being punished by angry gods. It was simply caught in the crossfire of our own planet's violent geology. With the mystery finally solved, we are left with a chilling realization about the fragile nature of everything we have built.
The year 536 stands as a stark, humbling reminder of a truth we often choose to forget. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how grand our empires or how complex our global economy, human civilization is ultimately a guest on this planet. We exist only by the perimeter of Earth's fragile climate balance. The citizens of the ancient world looked at the dark sky and believed they were witnessing the literal end of days. In a way, they were right. The world they knew did end. The golden age of the Roman Mediterranean was buried in the plague pits. The grand palaces of Teotihuacan became tombs of ash. The political maps of Europe and Asia were torn apart and rewritten from scratch. But humanity did not vanish. From the literal ashes of the old world, the foundations of the medieval and modern eras were slowly born. We learned to adapt. We developed new systems of agriculture, and we built new societies out of the ruins. We survived the darkest century in our history. Today, we look back at the catastrophe of 536 as a distant, fascinating story from a dusty textbook. But the warning it leaves behind has never been more relevant. Our modern 21st century world is infinitely more connected than the Roman Empire ever was. We rely on complex, hyper-connected global supply chains, fragile agricultural networks, and a delicate global climate. We live in a world where a crisis in one corner of the globe can shatter economies thousands of miles away in a matter of seconds. The volcanoes that broke the world in the 6th century are still out there, sleeping. And history proves that sooner or later, they will wake up again. The only question that remains is whether we will be ready to face the darkness, or if we will suffer the exact same fate as those who came before us. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history's darkest hour. If you want to join us on more journeys into the greatest mysteries of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on all notifications, and leave a like to help this channel grow. And before you go, I want to leave you with a question to think about. Looking at our modern world today, do you think we are just as vulnerable to a total systemic collapse as the ancient world was? Or will our advanced technology save us? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next episode.